Hey, women of welcome, Bree here, and I was having a conversation with Matthew Soerens a little bit just over text and just our team and just talking about all the headlines with the busing of migrants and the flights to Martha's Vineyard and all of that. And then I just thought maybe the conversation that our team is having, the conversation that Matt and I have, would be helpful just for this community to tune in as well. So Matt's going to join me, Matt from World Relief, Church Mobilization and Advocacy. And we're just going to talk about that. I thought, if we're going to talk about it internally, we might as well just kind of let the community know and just kind of get our take about, who's coming? Who's coming? Why do we see this flood of people? Who are all these people? Are the headlines correct? Are we looking at this in the right way? Why does it appear that there are more people than what maybe we've seen before? So, hi, Matt.
Hey, Bree, good to see you.
Good to see you too. I was just telling the community that, when all these kind of major headlines surface, we all tend to have kind of these internal conversations and text messages that go back and forth. And what do you know here? And what research do we have here? And what do we think our community needs to hear from us? And how could they be equipped and be confident to speak to the dignity and really the humanity of the situation? And so Matt's joining me from World Relief. So thanks, buddy, for joining us.
Yeah, glad to do it.
Yeah. So, okay, let's first start with, it appears that there are more people coming, more people being let in. And I think the very first thing people think about is, in this current administration, are there open borders? And we've talked about this, and it's about really defining open borders, open borders being unmitigated and unregulated, people allowed to come into the U.S. We don't have open borders, nor is anybody in the current administration advocating for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't now, and basically for a very long time, we've never had either open borders nor closed borders. That is to say, the border is open to certain categories of people, like U.S. citizens, for example. You show up with your passport, they will let you in. Mm-hmm. And a variety of other categories of people. It is closed to other categories of people. And sometimes those categories are shifting based on different policies. Mm-hmm. So it is true, there's more people arriving at the border without visas who don't immediately qualify to enter than there has been in a long time. Not necessarily ever, because if you go back to 2000, I mean, you and I were both pretty young then, but in the year 2000, fiscal year 2000, there was about 1.7 million apprehensions at the U.S.-Mexico border, but our government estimates another 2.1 million people got through without being apprehended. At that point, they thought they were catching about half the people who were trying to come. Right. The big change now is we're already at 1.8 million people apprehended in this fiscal year, about 3/4 of the way through. We're waiting on each month they give us new data. But now they think that they're catching 3/4 to 80% of people. So that's actually a good thing, right? I mean, measuring how many people are apprehended, that then begs the question, well, how many people didn't get apprehended? And the good news is there's a lot of reason to think that far fewer people are getting through unapprehended. Part of that is more Border Patrol agents now. Part of it, frankly, is the strategy of people coming is not people trying to sneak in for the most part. There's some of those people still, but it's people who want to find the Border Patrol to seek asylum. Right. And that goes to the second question of, well, do they qualify to come in the United States?
And that's the big, huge thing.
And one thing that basically what we're seeing right now in terms of those categories, well, to whom is the border open after being processed potentially, and to whom it is completely closed.
Right.
The Title 42 policy, which we've talked about here in the past, it's this public health rule, is still in effect. The courts have actually ruled that until they have the time to rule on it, the Biden administration can't just end it altogether. But it's mostly in effect for Mexicans and people from the Central American Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Now, 4 or 5 years ago, those were the countries we were talking about at the border, the countries where almost everyone was coming from, with very small exceptions. Mm-hmm. But what we've seen in especially the last year, is large numbers of people coming from other countries beyond Central America. And the places we're seeing a lot of people coming from right now in particular is Venezuela. In Venezuela,
Haiti, yeah.
Also Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, and there's some commonality in those countries.
Yes.
Much smaller numbers of people coming from from Africa or, from, other parts of the world, but those people would need to get a tourist visa to get to across the ocean. So most of these people from the Western Hemisphere, and if you look at Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua, frankly, these are countries with sort of left-leaning authoritarian regimes that our government, our State Department says are not good places, that are repressive towards their people, that have, really cracked down on human rights and on political expression, and also have frankly wrecked their economies. I mean, the economy of Venezuela, for example, it was the richest country in South America not that long ago. And now, and I have a number of Venezuelan friends, it's devastating to see just the conditions of horrific poverty that people are living in Venezuela. And that's not new. I mean, people have been fleeing Venezuela for several years. There's 5 million people who fled Venezuela. I mean, these are numbers similar to what we've seen in Syria or other contexts. What is new is people have become desperate enough that they are making the trip all the way north to the United States.
Yeah.
Notably, we've offered very little in terms of refugee resettlement for Venezuelans, for those people sitting in Colombia or Ecuador or, other neighboring countries. Had we done so, people might feel that there was hope of eventually reaching, if they were still in a really bad situation in that neighboring country, of being resettled to the United States. But I think people have become very desperate. More and more people leave Venezuela. And it is true, not universally, but for the most part, when Venezuelans show up at the border, they are not being... they're being exempted from Title 42, frankly, not just because of U.S. policy, but primarily because Mexico won't take those people back. So it becomes this complicated foreign policy dynamic. And that's, we've seen in the news asylum seekers being kind of bussed or shipped all over the country. From what I understand, we're mostly talking about Venezuelans. So there are also Cubans and Haitians and some other countries of origin in those groups. What we're usually not seeing is Guatemalans or Hondurans or Salvadorans or Mexicans, the people that we were talking about, a few years ago, showing up at the border in large numbers. But because those people are still being largely turned right away. Of the 1.8 million people who've been, well, that's not even true to say 1.8 million people. Of the 1.8 million encounters, and some of those are double counted, this fiscal year, it's roughly half and half, the people who were turned away under Title 42 and those who were actually processed under our normal immigration laws, which means that if you have a credible fear of persecution and you want to seek asylum, you're either detained, and some people are detained for long periods of time, but especially if you're a family or, frankly, because there's just not detention capacity, more often people are being released. And the numbers showing up right now are really overwhelming. We do not have the capacity in place to process people in this large numbers of people coming and seeking asylum. But that doesn't mean that they don't qualify under our laws to seek asylum.
And I was just going to say, so, we talk about Title 42 a lot, and we'll share what that is if you're not familiar with what Title 42 is. But Title 42, this public health code that was put in place to help mitigate Americans being exposed to COVID, is still kind of really honestly the mitigating factor. It's a mitigating immigration policy right now that's not being applied consistently from border sector to border sector. And so you have you've got all this probably hearsay and miscommunication along the border of well, I got in here and you got to have to go here. Because we're not applying it consistently, there's confusion and there's also hundreds of thousands of people who are being taken advantage of by the cartel because we can't get our act together on this side of the fence. So it kind of just leads to, well, we can't take everybody. And obviously some of these border states are feeling so overwhelmed that they are trying to make a point. And I get that. You're hey, we have been voicing that we are desperate for federal help to step in, and we're not seeing it, so we're trying to make a point. I guess, neither you or I agree with the way in which they're making that point, but and I know what we usually say to this, but what would you say? It's we can't take everybody. So what do we do?
Yeah, what I would say is we ought to take the number of people who qualify to come in under our laws. And if that's not too many people, then we should change laws. But, that's the process in our country. And a large number of people are coming in, and they're most other options in terms of just going to an embassy and applying for a visa in their country of origin, or a Venezuelan in Ecuador or in Colombia, there have been very limited options there. So they're making their way to the border, where it's sort of their last resort. Now, the reality is we have
because you cannot seek asylum, just so people know.
Yeah.
You can request a visa at your embassy, but you cannot request asylum, seek asylum,
start that process unless you
unless you
are on
get to the
U.S.
United
soil.
States. Yes.
So it is like a little bit baffling, I think, to all of us kind of in this space of why can we not get solutions created in countries so that people don't make these dangerous treks? But when it comes to people coming to the border and they make that trek, I mean, like, I guess one of the questions that I have been asked is like, well, is there ever a stop to the flow? Like, is there a cap of how many people they would take at the southern border? Because if not, we're in big trouble.
I mean, two things to that. There's not a cap in our laws. There's no law that says we will take 50,000 asylum seekers and then we don't have any obligation to people. And that's for good reason. We used to have caps, and enough Jewish people came from particular countries that they overflowed the caps during the Nazi era, and we sent people back. Now, those were really low caps, arguably caps that should never have been in place in the first place. But basically, the commitment of the United States, going back to when we formed the laws that are the foundation of our refugee and asylum system, is if someone's fleeing incredible fear of persecution, not they're just fleeing a hard economic situation.
Yeah, poverty is not,
that's not going to qualify you as sympathetic as it would be. But if you're fleeing a credible fear of persecution for specific reasons, race, religion, political opinion, national origin, political or social group, you qualify if you make it to the border. But to your point, Bree, it would be really very much in our interest as a nation and in the interest of vulnerable people to have more lawful migration options accessible closer to home. Whether that's refugee status for those, I mean, again, there's 5 million refugees, and the vast majority of them from Venezuela, whether they're formally refugees or not, but there's 5 million people that the UN Refugee Agency counts just in those neighboring countries. We should be bringing more through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program once we've determined they qualify to come. But also, frankly, we should be, we have a labor shortage. Why wouldn't we have more agricultural work visas? And there's legislation to do that. There's a Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It's passed the House. It's got bipartisan support. That would, it wouldn't solve the problem, but it would, on the margins, there would be some people who would say, you know what, I'll go get a work visa instead and not make this dangerous journey. We should have more of those options that don't require making it to the border. But I do think it's really important that we not turn our back on the principle of if you are fleeing a credible fear of persecution, we won't turn you back. What we need to do is have the capacity much more than we currently have. Right now, the reason people are let in is because they have to wait for a court date. Not all people are let in again, but those who are, they have to wait for a court date. And the average wait time for an asylum hearing in court is 5 years.
And it used to be like, even just a year ago, it used to be a couple years less than that. So you can tell that the numbers are really increasing in the fact that, and we are not meeting.
We're not increasing capacity for adjudicating asylum applications at a sufficient pace.
Right.
And that's I think one of the recommendations World Relief has had for a long time for different administrations is we're not saying everybody should be allowed in. We are saying there ought to be due process to ensure that we don't send someone back who qualifies under our law who would be at risk of persecution, even risk of death. And that comes from our pro-life commitment that we believe that every person is made in the image of God. We want to be really careful and err on the side of caution before sending someone back. But that doesn't mean the current situation is adequate. Clearly, it's not. Frankly, if it takes 5 years to get an asylum court ruling, that's both unfair to the families waiting 5 years, and for the first many months of that, they're not eligible for work authorization.
Right.
Which means, unlike a refugee who comes in who, we can help them find a job on day one if they want. They're authorized to work, and frankly, there's plenty of employers looking for them. An asylum seeker, we can help them with jobs training skills. We can help them learn English. We can, help support them in a number of ways, but we can't help them get a job legally because they're not authorized to work. And that can take a long time. There is legislation to fix that too. Senator Collins in Maine and Senator Sinema in Arizona have a bill that would say if you've been allowed in to seek asylum and you've filed for asylum on a much quicker basis, you'd be able to apply for work authorization, which would actually, honestly, that would help address some of the labor shortage needs we have in the United States while also, these people are in this hard spot because they're not allowed to provide for themselves, which is what they want to do. But if we had a faster asylum system, that would also deter people from coming and filing claims that maybe are sort of marginal. I've never claimed that everyone who shows up qualifies. So I think it's worth noting with Venezuelans in particular, in the last fiscal year of all the judges' decisions in immigration courts on Venezuelans seeking asylum, about 3/4 were approved. So a lot of these people actually probably are going to win asylum eventually, but it might take them a long time. And that speaks to the current realities in Venezuela.
So, naturally everyone's like, well, though not everybody that is coming to, seek asylum is has that credible fear, and they're just looking to take advantage of the government, and they're just trying to kind of get one over on the US. And I guess my response to that is usually like, just knowing the vetting that people have to go through, I'm like, do you really think it's not very reasonable, I guess, in my mind, to think that a poor family or a couple or an individual who is seeking asylum and makes that application with a false statement or a false pretense, that they're going to evade the strongest vetting process that really exists across the globe. I mean, you have to go through 5 different departments of the U.S. government, including the CIA, the FBI. You have biometric scans. You've got then there's a testing of and a vetting and an investigation of your story and the credibility and the consistency of it. And the onus is on you to prove that you meet the requirements. Okay. And so while you might have a lot of people file for asylum that do not apply, that is going to be found out, and then that person is going to be deported based off the fact that they didn't meet the requirements. And also, you have trained immigration personnel along the border that are trained to understand what a credible fear is of persecution. So a lot of these people, it's not like, one of the things that's just so frustrating to see is that the headlines keep saying illegal migrants being bussed here, being flown here. Nobody that's on that plane, nobody that's on that bus is here illegally. They have gone through an initial vetting process. And the fact that we are dropping them off in places that without notice is not helping anybody. If anything, you are causing further trauma and pain to a family who has probably trekked thousands of miles to come to the strongest nation in the world, only to kind of be bussed around the country as a political pawn.
Yeah. Let me say 2 things. One, I think it is important to know that one challenge of really long wait times for asylum hearings is there are a percentage of people who lose their asylum claims, but the federal government doesn't follow up on the deportation. So there are people who didn't win their asylum claim who are they basically became undocumented.
Yeah.
That does happen sometimes. And, I'm actually sympathetic to someone who's been a part of my church for 3 years waiting on this hearing, was devastated to lose their case. And I don't want them to be returned, especially when their employer who's hiring them, with work authorization, but then it gets withdrawn, they don't want them returned. If we had a more efficient system, that would largely address that. People would learn, you get sent back fairly quickly if you don't qualify. And if you do, you qualify for permanent status much more quickly.
Right.
The second point, though, is in terms of the transportation dynamic, buses and now even airplanes. This started with buses back several months ago. And honestly, my first reaction was, well, that seems oddly generous. Because you and I have both been at the border, Bree. We know that what usually happens, if lots of people get turned away without ever being considered for asylum under Title 42, or because they just fail a credible fear interview. But many others are allowed in the United States. They're allowed to, basically they're dropped off at nonprofits and church-based shelters and Catholic Charities and other groups like that. And those great folks in nonprofits and churches basically help figure out, okay, who do you know in the United States? And they say, well, my cousin's in Chicago. And they call the cousin and say, hey, can you buy a bus ticket for your cousin? He's come to see you. They usually know that already. Or in Colorado or in New York or wherever. So when we heard, the state of Texas is going to help buy bus tickets to New York or DC or now Chicago, on the one hand, if someone wanted to go to Chicago or New York, it's pretty nice to the taxpayers of Texas to spend several $1 million on transportation. It's very generous in a sense. Now, I'm not naive enough to not realize that there's some political reasons that they choose DC to start or, New York.
When you're like, that's really nice. I'm like, yeah, but it's not the point.
That's maybe not the intention, but you know what? I will receive it in that way. As long as those people are genuinely and entirely voluntarily getting on those buses and they know where they're going and they're not being deceived. What I've been a little upset by in the last few days is stories of people who ended up, in Martha's Vineyard on an airplane who don't know what Martha's Vineyard is. They didn't come in and say, well, I'm trying to get to my cousin in Martha's Vineyard or my sister lives in Boston.
No one that
they were recruited
who lives there.
Yeah, I mean, from some of the reports, what these asylum seekers are saying, and again, mostly Venezuelans, they were given some false information about you're going to get work authorization here or whatever the case may be. And that, I think, is very unethical to be misrepresenting the situation. But most importantly in all of that, we're talking about human beings who are people made in the image of God. They're not political props for one party or the other. And I think this has gone, this is mostly one side doing the busing, but sometimes the response from the other side is call in the National Guard, how dare you, as if these people were some sort of a threat or a burden to be, you know, to receive. To the contrary, I think that, you know, I'm glad that people are coming to Chicago. I'm not if they didn't want to come to Chicago, but if this is where their cousin is, or this gets them closer to their, you know, their uncle who lives in Milwaukee, great. And we're a community here in Chicagoland where I live that has been welcoming people for decades. And we don't necessarily care who paid for the bus ticket. Again, these are people who our federal government has done some initial screening with and determined they're, you know, for one reason or another, they should be allowed in. Most of the time with these Venezuelans, it's because they have strong asylum claims. And we did a background check. We don't think they're a security threat. Rather than detain them, let's let them go live with relatives or maybe be supported by a nonprofit or a church. And World Relief Chicagoland is doing all that we can in partnership with a lot of other great organizations here in Chicagoland to help support people. Now, coordination would be helpful. Knowing when people are arriving would be really useful. But I'm also aware that, you know, we've both been to El Paso or other parts of the Texas border. They don't always get a lot of advance notice when a bus is being dropped off. And they've built pretty impressive systems to get people a shower and a warm meal and a place to sleep, usually for a night or two, while they're figuring out where's this person onto in a bus or on a plane. And, you know, that has always spread out beyond the border region. Like Texas and California and Arizona and New Mexico, they bear the initial brunt of this. But even to the extent that Texas and California bear it, it's not the border regions. It's Houston and Dallas and, you know, Los Angeles and San Francisco is where people are going, not the regions right on the border for the most part. They're passing through there. And again, they're not sneaking in. And they're not coming in to do harm. They're coming up with their hands open saying, you know, please, we heard this country will help people fleeing a dictator in Venezuela. Is that still true? And I want that to still be true. That doesn't mean we can take everybody. We should be working with allies all over the world to say, how do we help address the situation? And Venezuela is not the only country where we should be, you know, with really horrific governments that we should be receiving from. But fundamentally, the people getting on buses who fled Venezuela, whether they fled a week ago or a month ago or 5 years ago, they're awfully similar to the people fleeing Ukraine and the people fleeing Afghanistan and others, in that they're fleeing, you know, a fear of persecution, in this case, often based on their political opinions, that they're not in line with the socialist authoritarian government of Nicolas Maduro. Sometimes having lived in just extreme poverty that's been created by that government, really wrecking an economy. And they're also very often sisters and brothers in Christ. And that's, I think that for those of us who are believers, something we ought to not look past too quickly. Not that we shouldn't care for them if they weren't, because if they weren't, it's, you know, it's an opportunity for us to be ambassador of who Jesus is. But these are our sisters and brothers showing up looking for help. They're showing up, and one of the first things they're looking for is, where can I be a part of a church? My local church, the Spanish-speaking church, we had a Venezuelan couple walk into our, you know, lobby last week on Sunday. Who showed up in this area relatively recently. And, you know, there's a lot of people in these situations who are fellow followers of Jesus, who are ready to, like, join us in mission in this country. But they also, you know, they need some support as well. They're they've gone through just incredible hardship that most of us can't and don't want to fathom in what they had to leave in the first place. And then, frankly, in the journey north, which is very often very, very risky. All sorts of people prey upon vulnerable people in various countries. And they're still, in some ways, political pawns, even having arrived here. Well, they are in the eyes of a lot of people. They're not in the eyes of God. In the eyes of God, they're people who are made in his image, and they're people who he commands us to love as neighbors.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to understand that, one, not every headline you read is actually getting this right and representing and actually affirming the dignity of people. We at World Relief and at Women of Welcome, we don't call people illegal aliens or illegal immigrants. We want to be dignified in the way that we talk about image bearers. So we talk about people being here undocumented immigrants, or you can talk about someone being here illegally, but we're not framing a person as an illegal alien, even alien itself. When I see those headlines, I cringe. I mean, when we it's such outdated language when we think about what we define kind of an alien as these days, someone otherworldly, someone who's a creature, who's not of the planet Earth. And it's it's a non-human being. And so you just think about, like, you know, what could be a dignified way, even if I don't agree with what's going on at the border, I don't agree with our the laws that we're having to follow right now because we haven't done our due diligence in Congress to get things passed and get things done, the very least we could do would be to hold our friends and to hold our local news stations and our just even the national news headlines accountable for how they talk about people, and to also not be so ready to buy into the fear narrative. Yes, people are coming, but the people that are here that are being bused are here legally. They are here legally and they have passed initial vetting and screening. And so when you see those headlines that say illegal immigrants, illegal aliens here, know that those are asylum seekers who have gone through such a hard journey to come here. And not all of them are going to get to stay. And that's just part of our laws right now. But taking into consideration that we want to be people first because Jesus was people first, we need to start talking about people in a better way. And we need to hold other people accountable to that better language and that better conversation. And also just to be smarter about what is someone trying to get me to click on? What is someone trying to get me to believe? What is somebody trying? What's the motive of the person writing the piece or sharing the headline? Is it someone who has genuine concern for these people who have gone through cartel territory and are fleeing horrific situations in their home countries, who've never really wanted to leave their home country in the first place? You talk to so many of these asylum seekers and they don't want to leave home. Who wants to leave everything they've ever known, their whole community, all the resources that they know and have, their language, all of these people, a culture, church, all these things, to come here and then be bussed around the US like an animal, like cattle, and be used as a political pawn? We can do better. We should do better. And I hope, Matt and I, that's just like our challenge to you all, is that we can and should do better. And right now, to just have the wherewithal to understand maybe what's being put in front of you and how that's not the whole story.
Yeah.
What else would you say would be helpful for people to know?
Yeah, I think you said it really well. I mean, and I would just go back to our first reaction to this is often like the Republicans are wrong or the Democrats are wrong. And I think we need to take a step back from all the political mudslinging. Not that there's not right and wrong, but to say, let's not make this about the governor or the mayor. Let's make this about that individual person who's made in God's image, that family. And how do we think about them as followers of Jesus? And like, let the politicians fight. And that's not to say that there's not an important role for policy. Frankly, there's some federal policies that could have prevented a lot of these situations, and we should be pursuing those. But our role should be to be talking about people, to be thinking about them, and to be interacting with them wherever we can find opportunities. And we're doing our best at World Relief to plug into those opportunities when they present themselves. We've been serving asylum seekers, World Relief, way before they started arriving on buses paid for by any state. They were arriving on buses paid for by other people. But we should be doing all those things and be doing so in a way that is rooted in this idea that these are people made in God's image with inherent dignity and with potential. Like, they have some needs right now, but like, give them 10 years and they will be like running small businesses and employing other people. Like, that's the history of immigration in this country. Mm-hmm. And that's because they're people made in the image of a creator God with that potential. And we've seen that with groups of immigrants, one after another, for centuries in this country. The people are resilient. The United States benefits enormously from frankly, the hardship in other countries that compels people to leave. It has helped make this country what it is, for not just in the last year or 10, but for a long time. That's been a huge part of our story in this country, and it's part of most of our stories. Like, we can go back and trace it, at some point when our ancestors left somewhere else, not always voluntarily, but in my case, it was voluntarily leaving Holland. I don't even know the whole stories, but what I do know is when I read the Old Testament and God tells the people of Israel, you shall love the foreigner who resides among you, because you yourselves were foreigners in the land of Egypt, that we're supposed to remember our own histories and let that inform how we treat other people. And I think we pretty quickly moved past that. And that, I'm a few generations removed from that, so maybe I don't have that story in my mind, but that's precisely what I had told the people of Israel, to keep rehearsing that story. They were supposed to present their offering and say, my father was a wandering Aramean and he went down, and, the whole story of the Exodus. And we're supposed to remember that precisely so that we know how to treat the people who come after us.
Yeah. And in that same Levitical text, it's treat the foreigner as if he were native born.
Yeah.
So do we think that we are actually doing that? And if not, how do we enter in so that we can follow what God's heart in all of this? So naturally people ask, what can I do to help? And I think number one, we've always said World Relief is the resettlement agency that we think that is the best, one of the best investments you can make in helping those who are here and seeking asylum. There's plenty of other ministries along the border that we've talked about. We've talked about Ibarra Frontiers and Border Perspectives. We've talked about Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande and Catholic Charities in general, Lutheran Family Services. You know, I don't have a World Relief in my local city, and I have a Catholic Charities, but they don't do refugee resettlement because Lutheran Family Services does resettlement. And so sometimes you just have to kind of poke around and really find where you can plug in, because people will be coming. People are coming. And these resettlement agencies, because they were really dismantled and underfunded during the previous administration, there is a ramping up process. You're having so many people come in, and then these resettlement agencies really need people to step up. And so that's where you can get involved, is try locally. And if not locally, then donate nationally and do what you can on that front. Anything else on that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely affirm that. There's lots of good ministries all over the country. At World Relief, the way we do this is a community called The Path, that is just people who basically say, you know, I don't know where the next crisis is going to come from, but if you trust World Relief to make those determinations, become a path maker. If it's, you know, I can do $10 a month or $50 a month or $100 a month, but that allows us to really nimbly respond. You know, when suddenly, with very little notice, we were told people were showing up in Chicago. Well, we're here in Chicago, and we worked with other partners in the community to say, how can we help? And you know, we're still figuring out what that process is looking like, but we've been involved since the very beginning, and we're able to do that, you know, without necessarily having governmental funds or that sort of thing, because we have this community of people who are part of the path, who say, I'm going to give monthly so that World Relief can rely on those resources when there is a crisis, whether that's an asylum seeker crisis or Afghans rather suddenly coming in through the airport, or, you know, an earthquake in Haiti or something else around the world. It allows us to respond really quickly, and we're really grateful for that support. So people can find the path on the World Relief website as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I hope this was helpful
Bree.
for you ladies. And I know it's always helpful when we get to chat about it internally. And so I just thought, you know what, let's just take this online and have this conversation now. So, all right, as the headlines unfold, we'll be back in touch with you all, but hopefully this was helpful. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye.